Hi everybody, this is James Tompkins and welcome to Lecture 5 of the International Finance Series. And I think I'll start off the way I normally start, and that is, what is the overall theme of this class? International financial principles as it affects firm value. And value is a function of what two things? Risk and return. And what element of risk have we been looking at that you say correlate internationally as opposed to maybe domestically? Exchange rate risk, right? So we've spent the first several lectures hopefully getting a solid understanding, not memorization, but understanding of why the dollar goes up and down in value. And as I've mentioned, we'll be using that as a springboard to look at other types of exchange rates. In fact, that'll come in the next lecture, Lecture 6. And what I thought we'd do today, however, was get into some fundamentals, if you will, when it comes to exchange rates. Some things that you really should know if you're going to get through an international finance class. So beginning with the agenda, essentially what we're going to cover is, what are exchange rates? Okay, well that's fundamentally simple obviously, but we'll maybe look at it at a slightly deeper level than one might think. How are exchange rates communicated? Again, that's going to be pretty fundamental. And then finally, if we're going to be looking at exchange rate risk, well, how do we calculate that percentage change, or the amount that the dollar or whatever currency goes up and down in value? So that's the agenda for today. So let's get into it. So question number one, what is an exchange rate? Well, you're probably thinking, well, it's how many dollars it takes to buy a euro, or whatever it is. Maybe it's $1.30 to buy a euro, and you'd be correct. And so from that perspective, would it be fair to say that it's a price? Sure. I mean, it's the price in terms of one currency for another currency. However, what makes it a little bit different is that when it comes to buying stuff, when a dollar buys, if it takes, say, $100 to buy a book, you might say, well, the price of the book is $100, right? But would you ever say, as it says here, that $1 costs 0.01 books? You wouldn't, right? And that's where it can be slightly different, if you will. It's still a price, but it can be slightly different in how that price is communicated. In any case, it's nothing more than the amount of currency it takes in terms of another currency. But to illustrate the difference, you might say, hey, the US dollar costs 0.5 UK pounds, or the UK pound costs $2. So that's what an exchange rate is. Now, how are exchange rates communicated? Well, that depends whether you're talking about the wholesale market or whether you're talking about the retail market. And they have different terminology depending upon whether you're talking about wholesale or retail. Wholesale, they talk about American terms and European terms. Retail, they talk about direct quotes and indirect quotes. But I'll start off with saying, well, what do I mean? I mean, what's the difference between the wholesale and the retail market? What do you think, the wholesale market, you think those are the big guys, the little guys? Those are the big guys, right? Those might be the big commercial banks or central banks or multinational corporations. The little guys, the retail market, that's someone like me, say, and I go to Spain and I've got dollars and I need euros, and I see a counter in the airport that'll change money. So that's the retail market. And depending upon whether we're talking about the communication of exchange rates in the wholesale market as opposed to the retail market, there's some slight differences. In any case, as I mentioned, the wholesale market, it's either something called American terms or European terms. And when we're talking about exchange rate communication, the only difference is that generally a dollar is part of the quote, and given that, or assuming that, American terms simply means, all right, well, we're going to put dollars on top. Okay, so you might say, hey, it takes $1.60 to buy a pound. okay? And European terms, it's the opposite. You might say it takes 100 yen to buy a dollar. Okay, so for example, I'm looking at an old Wall Street Journal article right there, and if I look at it, it says the greenback, that's the dollar, fell 0.2% against the yen to 102 yen, and dropped 0.1% against the Swiss franc at $0.89. So in both cases, if I was going to take that article and look at the units, you would see, 102 yen per dollar, roughly, and you would see $0.89 per Swiss franc. Okay, so in that example, here we have 102 yen per dollar. Would that be American terms or European terms? That top one, that would be European terms, right? Because dollars are on the bottom. And what about this one? Would that be American terms or European terms? That'd be American terms, right? $0.89 per Swiss franc. So my point is when you read stuff in the Wall Street Journal or whatever it is that you read, then it's not always consistent. So what do you think dominates? Do you think American terms or European terms dominates? In other words, when exchange rates are communicated and dollars, is it typical where the communication is such that dollars are on the bottom, like European terms, like with the yen, 100 yen per dollar, or the other way around? Well, it used to be crystal clear that European terms dominated. And the reason for that is because after World War II, the countries got together and they said, hey, how are we going to figure out, how much money costs in terms of other money? In other words, how are we going to figure out these exchange rate prices? And this was at something that's known as the Bretton Woods Agreement. And they all got together and they said, or a bunch of them got together and they said, well, I tell you what, why don't we price dollars in terms of gold? So why don't we say, and I don't remember if I have the numbers exactly correct, but why don't we say that $35 will buy you 1 ounce of gold? Okay? And so everything, the gold was pegged against the dollar, and then everything else, all the other currencies, were then pegged against the dollar. So the dollar was pegged against gold, and then everything else was pegged against the dollar. Okay? So it would be 5 Deutschmarks per dollar and 10 French francs per dollar. Again, I'm making up the numbers. Okay, but everything was relative to the dollar. And so from that perspective, you could say European terms dominated. Okay, so the dollar, so everything was pegged against the dollar, so that was the most common. Now, the pound, they said, no, I don't think so. We don't want to be on the bottom. Okay, so when you talk about us, it better be, say, $1.66 per pound. In other words, that they wanted to be on the bottom. So that would be consistent with what? European or American terms? American terms, right? If the dollars are on the top and the pounds are on the bottom. So why do you think they want to be different, and why am I not clearly saying European terms still dominates? Well, basically, as far as the pound goes, you could argue that it was maybe prestigious, right? I mean, why do you think the United States got picked in that Bretton Woods Agreement where the dollar was pegged against gold? Do you think it was because the United States was a major global economy, or because they're relatively insignificant? They were a major global economy, right? And so that's why the dollar got picked. And if you rewind the clock back, maybe 50, 100 years, was Britain a major global powerhouse? They were, right? I mean, remember the colonies and all that, right? And so maybe it was maybe a kind of a pride issue. And so now let's get to why do you think I'm not being crystal clear on what dominates today? Well, it's the euro, right? You think when the euro came into being that they wanted to be on the top or on the bottom? Remember, being on the bottom is more prestigious. They wanted to be on the bottom, right? So now when you look in the Wall Street Journal or whatever, and you read about the value of the euro, you're going to see something like, all right, well, it's $1.30 per euro. And of course, with the euro coming into being, that they wanted to challenge the US, as we've mentioned in an earlier lecture, for reserve currency status. In any case, that's how they're communicated in the wholesale market. That is, when a dollar is part of the quote. So let's look at the retail market. Retail market, it's a similar principle. What goes on top, what goes on the bottom, but they have different names. Okay, there's a direct quote, and that's where the home currency is on top and the foreign currency is on the bottom. So for example, if you're in Japan, well, what is the Japanese currency? It's yen, right? So if you had a Japanese direct quote, then what would be on top? The yen or the dollar? The yen, right? So here's a Japanese direct quote, yen per dollar. And guess what? Indirect quote, it's the opposite. Okay, the foreign currency goes on top and home on bottom. So if you're talking about a UK indirect quote, well, what's the UK currency? The pound, right? So that would be dollars per pound. Well, which dominates? Well, it used to be direct quotes dominate, but now for the same reason as we discussed earlier, that's not too clear anymore. So that's basically how exchange rates are communicated. What I want to get into now is an exchange rate percentage change calculation. And I would suggest to you that you already know how to calculate this. So for example, when $100 grows into $110, what was the percentage appreciation? 10%, right? Now, the exchange rate percentage change is identical. Now, how did you get that 10%? Okay, so when 100 grew into 110, how did you get 10%? Well, you probably took the difference, 110 minus 100, so the new value or the later value minus the earlier value, and then you divided it by what? By 100, right? So it's the same thing right here. Percentage change is the new minus the old over the old, or the 110 minus the 100 divided by the 100, or if you want to think in terms of exchange rates, E1 could be the later exchange rate, or the exchange rate at time 1, and E0 could be the earlier exchange rate, or the exchange rate at time 0, and then you just divide it by the exchange rate at time 0. So I'm guessing you already understand this. So let's do an example. Let's say 6 months ago, the exchange rate was $1.33 roughly per euro. And let's say today, it's $1.24 per euro. So we go from 1.33 down to 1.24. So here's my question. Has the dollar appreciated or depreciated? Appreciated or depreciated? So we went from this number, 1.33, down to 1.24. Well, you might be tempted to say, well, hey, clearly the dollar has depreciated, it's weakened because you're going from a bigger number to a smaller number. And normally that intuition may make sense when you're just working with regular numbers, but that is not the case with exchange rates. Okay, you have to actually think through it because earlier it took $1.33 to buy a euro, right? And now it only takes $1.24 to buy a euro. So in other words, you don't need as many dollars to buy the euro, which means a dollar can do more for you now than it did before, or less for you. Well, it can do more for you now, right? You don't need as many dollars to buy that euro, which means the dollar will have appreciated or strengthened or depreciated. It will have appreciated, right? Appreciated. So let's do the E1 minus E0 over E0. So which of these two, the 1.24 or the 1.33, which one of those would be the E1, the later one? That'd be this one, right? The 1.24. And so the E0 would therefore be the 1.33. So if we plug in the numbers, we get 1.24 minus 1.33, E1 minus E0 over E0, and I get minus 7%. Now, all right, so if we just cut it there, right, and you thought, and I'll just be blunt, would you have problems sleeping tonight if we just left it right there? Come on, admit it, you would, right? Uh-huh. Why? What's troubling about this answer? Well, did we just go through the thought process that when the exchange rate went from this 1.33 to the 1.24, did we go through the thought process that the dollar had appreciated or depreciated? Appreciated, right? So it's strengthened. So what's inconsistent about that with this answer? Well, we have a negative number, right? Minus 7%. Well, when we have a negative, does that suggest in percentage terms that something's gone down in value or up in value? Down in value, right? So what do we do wrong? If we want to know how much a single dollar has changed on a percentage basis, what are we doing wrong here? Well, the problem is we're not working in the correct units. This essentially represents how much a euro has gone down in value, not how much a dollar has gone up in value. I say essentially because you have to annualize it. I'll show you that in a minute. But in any case, if you're going to talk about a dollar, what has to be on the bottom here? Euros or dollars? Dollars, right? If you want to see how much a single dollar has changed in value, then you've got to put the units in terms of on a per dollar basis. So step one is make sure the units are correct. Okay? And in this case, we're looking how much a single dollar has changed. And so therefore, the units have to be on a per dollar basis. So if we look at the correct units, we originally had about $1.33 per euro. What do I have to do to that 1.33 to turn it into euros per dollar? I'll have to take the reciprocal, right? So here's the old. Okay, here's the E0. So just do 1 divided by this, and now I get euros per dollar. So about 0.75 euros per dollar. And of course, I have to do the same thing with my E1. So take the reciprocal of this. So 1 divided by 1.24, and I get about 0.80 euros per dollar. So now, do I have the correct units to do this calculation? If I want to know how much a single dollar has changed, am I now working with the correct units? Do I have it on a per dollar basis? I do, right? So now I can just get into the calculation. E1 minus E0 over E0. You already proved to me that you know that, right? When I asked you, hey, $100 grows into 110, you knew the answer was 10%. So you already understand that concept. So which of these two is the E1? Well, the later value is this 0.8, right? So if we put in the right units now we get this 7.6%. Notice, by the way, that was or was not the same as the minus number earlier. It's not, right? The minus number earlier was minus 7.05, a different number. So in other words, when the euro depreciated by 7.05%, in this case the dollar appreciated by 7.59%. So they're not the same. Why is that? Because the basis is different, right? The denominator. So in any case, there's one final still wrinkle to the way you communicate the percentage change is on an annual basis. So if this represents 6 months, what would I have to do to that number to annualize it? I'd have to multiply it by 2. And so basically, we could say, well, the dollar appreciated by 15.2%. That's how you would communicate it. Now, as I mentioned, the minus 7.05 represented what? The percentage change, we still need to annualize it, but the percentage change in the value of the euro. And as we mentioned, it's not identical to, it's just not a mirror image because the basis is different. Not a mirror image of how much the dollar appreciated. Let's do one slightly more complicated example. I mean, you might think this is more complicated. Who knows? So, Venezuela devalued their bolivar by 32% against the dollar. And so the question is, well, when they did that, when they devalued their bolivar by 32% against the dollar, well, how much did the dollar strengthen or go up? Okay? So first of all, when I look at this number here, this 32%, is it fair to say that there was a percentage change in the value of the bolivar? Fair or unfair? That's fair, right? So could I apply my E1 minus E0 divided by E0 formula? I could, right? And if I did, in the case of how much a single bolivar has changed, the answer would be equal to what? Well, certainly 32% or 0.32. And by the way, when you talk about this, just an aside, when you talk about anything percent, 32%, what does percent mean? It means divided by 100. So when you're working with formulas and stuff, do you work with English or do you work with mathematical numbers? You work with mathematical numbers. So we would have to say that E1 minus E0 divided by E0 is equal to plus or minus 0.32. Minus 0.32, right? So that's basically what this first sentence is saying, all right? Now if I wanted to, and I'll do this, I'll need this a little bit later, but I could multiply both sides by E0, and I get E1 minus E0 equals minus 0.32 E0. If you want, write it out on a piece of paper and convince yourself of this. And then I could add E0 to both sides. So minus 0.32 E0 plus E0 comes to 0.68 E0, and that's what E1 is. In other words, all of this is saying exactly the same as this. And so this is on a, is this in terms of dollars per bolivar or bolivars per dollar? Is this guy right here, is that how much a single bolivar has changed? It is, right? And so this is true for dollars per bolivar. But for a percentage change in the value of the dollar, what do we want the units to be? If we want to know how much a single dollar has changed, what do we want the units to be? Dollars per bolivar? I'll put it up here. If we want how much a single dollar has changed, okay? Do we want dollars per bolivar? So this is how many dollars for a single bolivar, or bolivars per a single dollar? This one, right? And so what do we have to do to each of these exchange rates to put them in the right units? Well, we have to take the reciprocal, right? And so on a percentage change in dollar basis, we have this 1 over E1 minus this 1 over E0 divided by this 1 over E0. Now, if you do the algebra on this, that comes to E0 over E1 minus 1. If you want, go ahead and do it on a piece of paper. If I take this and this, if I multiply this whole thing by E0 divided by E0, which is like multiplying by 1, right? Then this goes away and I get E0 over E1 minus E0 over E0, which is just 1, which is what I have here. Okay? So I have the percentage change in the value of the dollar as being E0 over E1 minus 1. And now what I'm going to do, this is why I did this thing earlier. If you recall, earlier I got E1 was equal to 0.68 E0. So I'm going to substitute that in right there. So I get the percentage change in the value of the dollar being E0 over 0.68 E0. So the E0's cancel, subtract 1, and I get about 47.1%. So in other words, when the bolivar went down by 32%, the dollar did what? It went up by 47%. Again, showing that it's not symmetrical. Okay, when one currency goes down by a certain percent, it's not a mirror image that the other currency goes up by the same percentage point. So in any case, that was a little, if you will, break from why the dollar goes up and down in value, but more of a focus on just some common international language that you need to understand, or calculations or whatever, as part of an international finance class. When I continue with the next lecture, we're going to get back into why the dollar goes up and down in value, but in particular, we're going to talk about international monetary systems. We're going to look at how much the market plays a role in defining exchange rates, and how much the governments play a role, and pros and cons, and so on and so forth. Because as I mentioned earlier, is that I said, well, I'll teach this from a dollar perspective, but then I'll use that as a springboard to look at other types of currencies and other types of currency systems. And that's what we're going to get into next. In any case, as always, I hope this was a good learning experience. And this is James Tompkins, and hopefully I'll see you at the next lecture. Take care. Bye-bye.